This picture was made in 1935 and shows Howard Moore, who worked for Daddy off and on for many years, on our horse Red Wing. And in the far left background on the horizon was the barn and the house, the pens where these sheep were being driven. And there were 4 or 5 of us taking about 5,000 head of sheep down to be sheared. This is Uncle Dwight MacDonald on Abby and Joe Midkiff on Stepper. Uncle Dwight had married one of Daddy's sisters, Aunt Gladys, and Joe was the oldest son of Daddy's older brother, Uncle Tyson. I took this picture in 1940, and there were several of us driving about 5,000 head of sheep in to be sheared, probably sometime in May or June. And I was taking the picture from the back of a horse I was riding named Ball Hornet. And way in the distance on the left-hand side, you can barely see the tops of the pens and the corral that we were driving them to. This picture was also made in 1940 at the same time, and it just shows a little bit of the ear of the horse I was riding, and we were driving that bunch of sheep down to be sheared. And again, the tops of the barn in the house was barely visible in the distance on the left side of the picture. This again was made in 1940, same bunch of sheep going the same direction, just taken from a little different angle. This picture was taken in 1948, and it was taken from the little rise south of the house. And in the distance you can see the ranch house and barely see the outline of the top of the cedar tree that was growing up down close to the windmill that was east of the house. This picture was also made in 1938 and shows a bunch of ewes that we had penned for waiting to be sheared at that time too. Even though I was just about 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old, I got to go and help round up everything that Mother and Daddy would let me ride to go with them. And this is looking east, a little southeast, toward what we call the buck trap, and there was a great big willow tree, that green one in the center back down there. And you will note how much very little mesquite showed up down there in that area then. It was all open and shows few mesquite on the right, but there wasn't very much mesquite that took over now. This picture was made in 1938, and we had penned a bunch of sheep, which consisted of some ewes and lambs, and the picture was made in what we call the horse lot in front of the saddle house. That was the barn door up there open, and then on the left of the barn saddle house was a bunch of saddle horses that we had tied the fence that we had used to round up the sheep with. And on the skyline above the horses is a pigeon house that Daddy had built for Mother because we had pigeons, and every once in a while we'd have roast pigeon to eat. This shows a picture of a bunch of ewe lambs that Daddy had cut off sheep that we had raised, and he'd saved these ewe lambs for replacement in the fall. And this picture was made in 1942, and it's a picture of the cedar tree in the background and a bunch of other little trees that were planted around the edge of the dirt tank that we had. This picture shows a group of ewes that were waiting to be sheared, and this was in 1940. I made this picture in 1940. And the shed in the background was what we called the sheep shed that Daddy had built back uh, before 1930 for when he got ready to lamb a bunch of ewes. They had stalls in inside, so in bad weather, he could have lambed out his ewes in this great big shed. It was about 50 feet long by about, I'd say 20 feet wide. This picture was made in 1939, and it shows another group of ewes to be sheared. Daddy usually kept the different pastures separated so that each group, when they were finished, we could take them back to the pasture where they came from that they were familiar with. And it shows on the other side of this close group a pen of sheep that were waiting to be sheared. And then at the back part of that second group, you can barely see the tops of the shearing machine and wool sacks and whatnot and down in there. So we tried to keep everything ready for when they emptied one pen of ewes that they sheared, or we'd have another ready to run in for them to keep shearing. This picture was made in 1942 and just shows another group of the ewe lambs that I had shown before that Daddy had saved back to be replacement ewes. This picture was made in 1932 and probably by Mother. Mother made some of these older pictures, but Daddy had put the bucks out with the ewes, and this picture was made in what we call the east water lot, and looking back toward the saddle house in the far background, and in the right background was a bunch of our corrals and pens and a few mesquite trees that were growing up in the pens. Dad let it grow up so we'd have some shade to work stock in when we worked our stock. But he always put his bucks out on October the 10th, which ironically was his birthday. But he would leave them, put them out then, and leave them about a month to 6 weeks. And because he liked to start lambing about March the 10th, as it took the ewes about 5 months of pregnancy to start lambing. This picture was made in 1935 and probably by Mother, and it shows Mr. Jim Cates with a bucket of rocks in his hand that he was shaking to rattle and help pin the ewes into a little crowding pen down there. And Dan Midkiff, our granddaddy Midkiff, was leaning over the chute there to help work the sheep through the chute, as Daddy was probably separating certain ones from others for some reason. But it was a good picture of showing the works of some sheep there. This is a picture of a group of sheep and that were waiting to be drenched. Daddy always drenched all of his sheep, usually in the fall again, so that they would be free of stomach worms and any internal parasites, so they could utilize all their food and the supplemental food that would be fed them to go into the winter. And this was a shed that Daddy had built in the background, in the corner of one end of the what we call the sheep shed back on the right. This picture was made in 1942 and shows a shearing crew shearing Daddy's bucks. And this was not Daddy's shearing machine. He would contact somebody, usually in Big Lake or Ozona, for a shearing crew to come up and either tag our sheep or shear bucks. And we always sheared the bucks after the ewes were sheared, as the buck's wool was coarser, and he didn't want to get that wool mixed up with the finer wool of the ewes, and that's why they shearing the bucks separate from the ewes. This picture was made in 1929, and I'm sure was made by Mother, since it was that early being made. And it shows sheep shearers shearing the sheep with a little 2-drop machine. At that time, there was not a lot of sheep in the area, and little 2-drop machine would take care of the shearing of the smaller number of sheep to be sheared. This picture was made in 1942, and it shows a shearer shearing my buck. I had a show buck, and back in that time period, the girls could not show in the 4-H program nor be a member of the FFA. And I had harassed and talked to county agent and Daddy into letting me finally get to show something. And Daddy, they let me exhibit. I could not compete, but I could exhibit this show buck. He was a 2-year-old buck, and beautiful staple wool on him. Had about 3.5, 4-inch staple wool on him, which is very long. He was an exceptionally good Rambouillet buck, and I got to exhibit him anyway. And that finally kind of broke the ice. Next year they did let girls come in and show livestock in the stock show. This is just another view of my buck being sheared, and that's me standing there with my hand on my knee, making sure he didn't cut my buck or scratch him up in any way, and or mess up his wool. He had a beautiful fleece of wool, and he was an exceptionally good shearer. This picture was made in 1940, and Daddy had built the shearing machine in the background, and it had 12 shears that could shear all at one time. And this is just a group of 3 of the men on one side that was shearing. And a good sheep shearer can shear about 100 a day. And these were good men. Daddy selected good shearers because he liked for them to make one cut and not have short cuts on the wool staple. This picture was made in 1936, and it shows some sheep shearers from Ozona that Daddy had gotten to come shear his sheep, and Mother probably made this picture. This picture was made in 1940, and it shows a crew that was tagging some ewes. That Daddy would hire this crew, usually from Ozona or Big Lake, just to come tag the ewes along in the either the latter part of January or up in February, before the ewes would start lambing the 10th of March. And note that high rock fence in the background back there. It was a rock fence that was about 40 feet long, and had been built as part of the old original pen that Dan Midkiff had built there when he homesteaded the place. This picture was made in 1937, and I probably took it since it doesn't have real good composure about it. But it shows a picture of Daddy's shearing machine that he had put together, and some of the crew that were shearing sheep on our plates. This picture was made in 1933, and probably by Mother, and that was Daddy with a straw hat on, crouched down there, and to his extreme left with a white shirt on was Dan Midkiff, and in the background was some of the shearing crew standing up there. This picture was made in 1935, and shows Johnny Hargis in the background with a white shirt on, and the Mexican boy up toward the front was the tar boy who carried a bucket of bone oil and pine tar mixed up, so he could paint any scratches on the sheep that when they were shearing them, that they scratched them or cut them to keep the flies off. And this was not Daddy's machine. It was some that he had hired to come up, because it doesn't look like it has a whole lot to it. This picture was also made in 1935, and again probably by Mother. And in the extreme left back there is Johnny Hargis, and this shows a Mexican shearer or helper that was fitting a wool sack into the ring that would be slipped into that rack, vertical rack right behind him, to hold the wool after he was cut and tied. This is a picture of Daddy's shearing machine that was highlighted in the background, and Dan Midkiff with a white shirt on there was holding the sheep, pretending to shear it. And on the extreme left is a man that was named Robert E. Lee. We all called him General. General's leaned over watching Dan. This photo was made in 1940, and probably by me, and shows Bill Moore that was branding the sheep in the center, and then next to him on this side was Joe Midkiff, my cousin, and in the background was Sam Midkiff, Daddy's, one of his younger brothers, and they were all helping us shear sheep. This shows a bunch of ewes that had just been turned out of the shearing pen, and where the shearing machine is in the background. This picture was made in 1935 and is a pretty good picture of the machine that Daddy had put together and on an old truck chassis, and rigged it up with a rod down the middle so the shearing machine drops could be dropped off of it. And then he put a metal top on it of corrugated tin, and then had a tarp that could be rolled up off of each side to put the shears in the shade, and that shows it rolled up above the heads of the Mexicans. And Ruben Gonzalez is in the center there with a white shirt on. He was a capitan of the crew, and then that's some of his shears that are standing up alongside of him. This picture was made in 1940, and probably by Hazelle, and shows this lead sheep standing up in the shearing machine compartment of Sam Cox's shearing machine. And Sam Cox also had a shearing crew, and Daddy would get him to come up and shear for him from Ozona sometimes. And this lead sheep, you could take him and put him in a bunch of sheep, and he, for some reason or other, knew which way to go, and he would take off, and a sheep will follow one sheep. No matter where it is, they'll follow him. And he would go clear to the back end of the pen you wanted him in, turn around, and then come back out the gate where the sheep had come in, and somebody was always there guarding the gate to let him out and keep the other sheep in. But he was super good at his job. This shows Daddy, Dick Midkiff, numbering and branding each one of his wool sacks. He would lay 2 big 4-inch pipes out on the ground to keep the wool sacks off the dirt. He always took pride in keeping his wool and his wool sacks clean. And each sack would hold around 21 to 22 fleeces when they were tromped and packed in there tightly, and then the top would be sewed up. And then Daddy would number each sack. You can see the brand on that first sack there that was called an open A, and it was branded around the left hip of all of his sheep. This picture was also made in 1940 and just shows Daddy how he would number each sack. Another 1940 view of him numbering sacks, and in the background right behind his hat you can see how another sack was hung and was being filled. with fleeces as they were being sheared. This picture was made in 1935, and it shows the truckload of wool that everybody, Daddy and all the help, had just loaded onto this truck, and it's Bill Moore up on top and Daddy back behind him, Dick Midkiff, and then Dan Midkiff was standing down on the ground by the truck. And this load of wool would be taken to Barnhart, where the wool and mohair warehouse was. This picture was made in 1937 and showing another truckload of wool. It was a cattle truck, and the sideboards had not been removed to have this wool loaded in on it. And that was Bill Moore up on top of the wool, up there, barely visible. And then if you'll look closely, you can see a little boy standing down there by the fence, and that was T.O. looking up there at him. And T.O. being one of my younger brothers. This picture was made in 1941, probably in about June, and it shows a herd of sheep being taken back to the pasture that they came from. And Bill Moore, correction, that was Arvil Moore, Bill Moore's brother, on one of the horses, and Jack Kinsey on one of the other horses, and I took the picture. And if you'll note, there's hardly any mesquite trees visible anywhere around in this area then. These sheep were going back to the Little Well pasture. That was the southeast corner of what we call the buck trap. This picture was made in 1941, and it shows Daddy drenching a ewe that is being held by Oscar Crawford, who was helping Daddy drench sheep. And Daddy always liked to drench his sheep in the spring, early in the spring, so that they'd be free of stomach worms and internal parasites to utilize all the good green grass and weeds that we got if it rained good. This picture was made in 1934, probably my mother, and it shows a bunch of sheep being brought in to the pens, probably to be sheared, and the horseback rider way in the background is not identified. But it looked like it must have been drives, it kind of dusty. This view was north of the barns. This picture was made in 1937 and shows, I don't know, probably 600-700 head of lambs that was in the what we call the east water lot, and Daddy had just stripped them off of their mothers and going to ship them to Fort Worth, usually where they went. This photo was made in 1939, and it shows a double-decker truck load of lambs being loaded up to be shipped off. And like I said previously, they usually went to Fort Worth. That seemed to be the best market. This is a photo of us marketing lambs in the south pasture, and those helping us with, on the extreme left was Bill Moore, and then Joe Midkiff, and then there was Oscar Crawford, and then Frank Midkiff, and then that was Bill Moore, I believe, there. Bill Moore, and Daddy was doing the marking of the lambs. And after we would cut off their tails and castrate the little males and earmark them, like Daddy earmarked them, he would drop them down there in the pen by themselves, and all their mothers were stayed back in the big pen where we'd catch the lambs from. And then they were all turned out together after we got through, and 2 or 3 of us would hold them together till the lambs all found their mothers. And Daddy carried all the panels, we call them panels, the wooden panels that and a roll of wire that he would construct a holding pen and a marking pen alongside usually a line fence in the pasture. And again, note how little brush there was in the background at that time. And in the year 2007, that's nearly all solid mesquite brush out there now. This picture was also made in 1940 at the same time the previous picture was, and that's Hunter holding the lamb and Frank standing there beside Hunter. That's Hunter Midkiff and Frank Midkiff, that were two of Daddy's brothers, and they were helping us. And that's T.O. Midkiff, little brother, standing down there by him. And in the background was Bill Moore, that was helping mark lambs. This picture was made at the same time in 1940 at the same place, and though you can't see who the people are, the one holding the lamb on the left was Joe Midkiff, Uncle Tyson's oldest boy, and the one on the right doing the vaccinating for sore mouth was Frank, one of Daddy's brothers. This picture was made in 1940 at the same place at South Pasture. At the same time, all the marking going on. That's a bunch of the little lambs that were marked behind us, and that's T.O. Midkiff III with Hazelle Midkiff Calcope. This picture was made in 1939, and it shows Howard Moore bottle feeding a dogie lamb. Daddy had given Howard this dogie lamb, little ewe lamb, and he called her Shirley, and that's T.O. standing there beside of him. This was out in front of our barn on the ranch. This picture was made in 1943, and it shows T.O. with his first place lamb at the Rankin 4-H show, and he had just won first place and was proud of that lamb. This picture is not very distinct, so you can tell what it is, but it was made in the southeast corner of the what we call east water lot, looking toward what we call the buck trap house, east of the house. And it was a picture of my mares and some of the colts that I had. And I remember the name of the horses. One of them was Faithful, and Nugget, and Ginger, and Smoky was Faithful's colt, and one I'd broken had ridden. And then Flicker was given to me by a friend of mine out of Midland. And then I had two colts in that bunch, and one of them was a filly colt that was given to me by Leonard Proctor, and Foy Proctor had given me a little sorrel horse colt, and both of these Proctor colts were out of Foy Proctor's remount stud that he had at that time. This picture was made in 1949, looking toward the little well pasture from the southeast corner of the buck trap, and it was after a pretty good January snow that we'd had, but you can see that how clear everything was of mesquite down there at that time. The mesquite had not taken over like it has now. It's all of that is so brushy with mesquite now in 2007 that you don't get the view that you have then. This picture was made in 1930, and I'm sure was made by Mother. Daddy had just fed his Hereford cows some cake, and they were eating cake, and from the looks how dry it was, well, it was during the 30s drought, and wasn't much grass on the ground, but Daddy always fed his cattle on little grassy areas that he could find, so the cattle could eat cake from the ground on as clean a area as they could find. This picture was also made in 1930 by Mother, and it just shows another group of Daddy's cows as they came up to be fed. This picture was made in 1920, and just shows cattle, the quality of cattle they had back then, and to them it was good quality cattle, even though there was looked like the Jersey milk calf standing over there to the far left, and it looks like the water trough had run over and made it muddy there when this picture was taken. This picture was made in 1924, and this was a Hereford bull that was purchased by my granddaddy from Henry Houff, and he was a good quality bull for that time. My granddaddy and daddy had him to upgrade the calves on the Hereford cows that they had, but right now he doesn't look like he'd have made a good steer. This picture was made in 1941 in the chute there at the ranch, and just showing Daddy branding a cow, and he had her head, holding her head down there at the squeeze chute at the end of it, and he was branding several of them that I guess he had bought, but they need to be branded, so he was branding them. This picture was made in 1946 at the Walcott Place, about 35 miles north of Midland, and it shows us vaccinating some and branding some calves up there. Dr. Camel that's him with his back to the camera. He was doing the vaccinating, and Hazelle was sitting down holding a hind leg of a calf in the shadows back in the center, and Horace Sutherland was at the extreme right. He was up there helping us, and Daddy's arm, Dick Midkiff's, was just barely visible in the upper right. He was coming with the branding iron to brand the calves. This picture was made in 1919, and it shows Daddy at the stock show in Midland there at that time with his prize-winning Hereford calf. This is the Midland Fair. This photo was made in 1919, showing some of Daddy and Dan Midkiff's Hereford cattle, and Uncle Herd can be seen driving them in the far background. This picture was made in 1939, and Daddy had decided he was going to try to feed out his own calves. Instead of shipping them off to market, he was going to feed them out. He had some feed, and he put them in the pen and made a feedlot out of some pens back there. And these are pretty good quality calves that you can see from their picture. And I don't remember what he brought, or how many they were, but he had fed them out, and I made a picture of them. This is a view of the good replacement heifers that Daddy had kept out of the steer end that he had kept and put on feed, and these were the replacement heifers to replace some of the ones that he had either sold or just wanted some more better heifers. This picture was made in 1939. This picture was made in 1940. Of them working some cattle through the chute there, and they were branding them, and that's Frank Midkiff on the left, and Uncle Herd is in the center, Herd Midkiff, and Daddy on the right, and those were Daddy's two brothers that were helping us work cattle at that time. This picture was made in 1924, and on the left it shows Uncle Bud Purcell standing, and he had married Dan Midkiff's sister, Aunt Jeffy, and Roy Price was holding the calf's foreleg, and then T.O. Midkiff Sr., Dan, was doing the branding. It's him standing up on the right in the background. This picture was made in 1938 by Mother and Hattie Mae Trammell Midkiff, and it just shows some heavy heifers at the salt block up near a windmill. These were Daddy's, some of his heifers that he was proud of. This picture was made in 1944, and it shows my 4-H club calf on the left and T.O. and his club calf on the right. And this was 2 or 3 years after I had talked the county agent into finally letting me exhibit also, when some other girls had finally been able to go into the 4-H program at that time too. Previous to that, they wouldn't let girls show for some reason. This picture was made in 1942, and even though Daddy's not in the picture on the extreme left, he was dehorning this cow, which had some old nubbins that were bothering her, and he had dehorned her, and that was Harvey Bailey, who was working for Daddy at that time. And Harvey was holding her head so that everything could get done just like Daddy wanted it. This picture is made in 1940 and shows Daddy branding his inverted F on this cow's left hip. This picture was made in 1942 and shows some cows and calves in the east water lot. This picture was made in 1940, and this shows Daddy had just fed a bunch of his cows in the snow that we had had a big snow in that year in January. But he fed his cows cake to keep them warm and give them something to eat. This picture was made in 1940 also, and just another view of Daddy's Hereford cows being fed cottonseed cake in the snow. Way in the background, you can't tell, but it's that long white streak like was what we call the lake. It was about a half mile wide and a mile long, and it was dry at that time, but it was covered with snow. But when it rained, a big rain, it would fill up, but it never was real deep. It was just a big flat lake, Playa Lake. This picture was probably made by Mother in 1930, showing a bunch of baby calves, some close and some way in the background, that their mothers were off grazing, and the mothers had left them there in a little wad to be there whenever they came back from grazing. This was made in the south pasture. This picture was made in 1943. Daddy had always raised Hereford cattle, but he decided he'd try some Black Angus cattle, and he heard about several being for sale by Massey West in Ozona, and he went down and bought a load of Black Angus cows from him, and I had driven them up to the north pasture. This was the north windmill, and had taken them to water, show them where water is. And Black Angus cattle don't have pink eye because their faces are not white like the Hereford cattle are. And Daddy had bought those Black Angus cattle, and they were really a nice bunch of cattle. This picture was made in 1923 with Daddy's old pet burro, Aunt Nell. Midkiff Benedict was one of Daddy's older sisters, and that is her standing there petting the old burro. This was made in front of the shed out the barn at that time. This picture was made in 1930, and probably by Mother, and it shows Westbrook, who was half Shetland and half stock horse, and Dan Midkiff had sold a bunch of cattle to a man in Westbrook, Texas, which is about 30 some odd miles west of Fort Worth, and he liked this little cow horse. He was a really good cow horse, and so he bought him and sent him back to Midland on the train. and he was not a kid horse, even though he wasn't real big. Only the cowboys could ride him, and it wasn't till after he got way up in years that we kids were allowed to ride him, and he lived until he was 36 years old, and he was buried on the ranch. This picture shows T.O. when he was 10 years old, and Daddy had made us some leather harness, and we had this pet goat, mutton goat, and he would pull the wagon, and Daddy rigged us up some little shafts to be attached to this little wagon that we had. And in order to make the goat go and pull the wagon, we tied a head of maize to the end of a long pole, and then hung that pole out, hold that pole out in front of him, so he would try to get it, and that would make him trot along to get to that maize, and we got him to pull us around like that. I made this picture in 1946, and it shows a little rat terrier dog that we had trying to lead off a colt that I was breaking the lead, and he had picked up the rope and was pulling on him. And Dr. Camel is shown standing to the left, and Daddy is standing to the right, and they're in front of a place we call the milk stall, because that's where we milked our milk cow. And that horse was called Smokey. I'd named him Smokey. And his mother in the background was Sunflower. This picture was made in 1925 by Mother, and it shows Prather Benedict on a bronc that was pitching down in the what we call the East Water Lot. And don't know who was on the horse in the background, but a guess was it was probably Daddy, Dick Midkiff. Every Sunday back then, well, a bunch of the young people would come down to the ranch, and they'd ride cows or broncs or something to entertain themselves. This was an old photograph probably made by Mother, and it wasn't dated, and the people in the picture was not identified, but it was made in the front yard of the ranch house, and the back room was Mother's and Daddy's bedroom, and the long part of the building was another bedroom and our living room. This picture was made in 1931 at Lois's second birthday party. It showed us kids sitting out in the front yard near the front porch. And clockwise, it was Joe Midkiff and Bill Midkiff and myself, Hazelle, and almost out of sight was Lois. And the blonde on the right side was Alice. Joe, Bill, and Alice were Uncle Tyson's kids. This picture was made in 1928, and it shows Hazelle sitting in a little tub of water, playing in the water out in the front yard of the ranch house. This picture shows Daddy, Dick, holding Hazelle at age 3 months, sitting on the front porch of the ranch house. This was made in 1927 also. This picture shows Hazelle sitting in a wagon. She was 13 months old, so it was made in 1928. And it's a good picture of the back of the house. Daddy had later enclosed the back porch in and made a screen porch out of it here that was made before he had done that. This picture was made in 1937 by Miss Alpha Lynn, who was our home demonstration agent at that time. And Mother was a member of the home demonstration club, and we 3 girls were members of the 4-H club. And Miss Lynn took this picture of us seated around the kitchen table there. Mother, Hattie Mae, Trammell Midkiff, and Daddy Dick, and Lois, and Hazelle, and Maydale. This picture was made in 1925 by Mother, but the group was not identified, but probably one of them was Daddy and his brothers who were out there visiting in front of the shed at the barns. This picture shows Daddy, Dick, holding Hazelle on her first horse at the age of 5 months, and made in 1927. This picture was made in 1915, and probably by Daddy, showing his brother, one of his younger brothers, Frank, on one of Daddy's horses called Old Banana Peeling, where Daddy came up with some of these names, only he knows. This picture was made by Mother, showing Daddy holding T.O. out on the north side of the house in the snow in January of 1936. This picture was made by Mother in 1928, showing Hazelle south of the house, sitting on a blanket in the snow. This is the same snowstorm, showing Hazelle sitting on a blanket on the north side of the house with the barns in the background. And Mother made this picture in 1928. This picture was made in 1947, and it shows Richard standing out in front of the backside of the ranch house that Daddy and one of his younger brothers, Hunter, and the crew were building. This picture shows the ranch house in 1949, and shows some trees that Daddy had planted around it. And it had big porches on 3 sides of it, the east, south, and west side of it, and had 3 bedrooms and only 1 bath, kitchen, living room, dining room. This picture was made in 1948, and it shows the fireplace that was built by one of Mother's nephews, and I don't remember the name of the nephew, but he was a real good rock mason, and he built a fireplace hearth and the chimney that went outside. This shows a picture of the big lake that was east of the house, about a half mile east of the house, and the lake was about a half mile wide and about a mile long, and it was real shallow all on the west side, and the only deep part, which maybe 6 feet, was against the east bank. But a flood of 12 inches in 2 hours filled it up in June of 1936. This picture was also made in 1937 by Mother, and shows a bunch of us kids out in the lake playing in the water. You can see it was real shallow water there. We were playing in the water. This picture was also made in 1937, showing a view of the lake, and it's hard to see, but there's a flat-bottom boat out in the middle full of kids and young people, and we were playing in the water. Daddy had this old flat-bottom boat, and we liked to play in it in the lake, in the water. This picture is made in 1939, and it shows T.O. standing in the road there watching Uncle Herd drive the tractor, and a grinder that was filling up a truck of ensilage, and that truck then would haul the ensilage over to the little well pasture where Daddy had dug in the side of a caliche hill a big long trench that was about 10 feet wide and about 30 feet long, and it was filled with this ensilage out of this lake, because the lake had dried up after the rain and had just enough submoisture in it that Daddy had planted corn and high gear and sorghum in it, and all of that ground up together made super good ensilage to feed the livestock in the coming winters. This picture was made in 1925 at the old fairgrounds in Midland at some kind of a festival or fair or whatever they were having up there, but it shows Daddy in the middle out there riding a cow in the cow riding contest. This picture was made in the spring of 1926, and in the background showed the ranch house and the windmill. That was the headquarters of the ranch at that time, and the light-colored object on the left in the foreground was Daddy's old pet burro, Jack, that was laying down there, and Daddy was bringing feed and water to him in that bucket. This picture shows Belcord Rutherford, who was a friend and neighbors of Daddy's there at the ranch, and it shows him on a bucking horse at the Midland Fairgrounds, and the old crazy horse had run over the fence with him right after this photo was made, and they finally caught he and Belcord way down in another pasture. This picture was made by Mother in 1939, and it shows Maydell, Lois, and Hazelle. I was kind of hidden behind the little tree, standing on the front porch of the ranch house. And the adobe house, what we called it, the adobe room, was the room that Daddy had built and added on the right over there where the vines were. This picture was made in 1924 and shows one of Daddy's favorite horses in the pens there at the house. He was called Old Roney. I took this picture in 1939, and it shows a little pusher-type airplane that was owned and used by Ray Bumgardner. And I believe Ray was from Fort Stockton, but the ranchers would get him to come out and help them hunt coyotes, and a big bunch of ranchers would get together with pickups and horseback to fly and look for coyotes in their pastures when they had one. And Ray had a shotgun mounted out on the nose of his plane, and he would shoot the coyotes from there. And Dick Mitkiff is standing in the back of the pickup filling up the little airplane with gasoline. And I don't know who all the rest of the ranchers and neighbors were, kinfolks and neighbors. This picture was also made in 1939. Just shows a view of the little airplane, and Ray Bumgardner and Daddy were standing right by the nose of the plane, and Ray was immediately on the left of the side, and Daddy was on the right with a light shirt on. Shows a pretty good picture of the little plane that Ray hunted from. This picture was made in 1933 during the severe early 30s drought, and Mother made this picture, and Daddy and Dan, Granddaddy Midkiff, had decided to find some grass somewhere available to take all their cattle to, and they found some at a friend's ranch about 35 miles due west of the ranch over near Crane, Texas, and we called it the Red Tank Camp. And Daddy and Dan and General, his name was Robert E. Lee, and everybody called him General, built a little cabin there, a little one-room cabin for him to stay in, and then they parked the chuck wagon next to the little cabin. That was where he had his kitchen, so to speak, and he was holding his pet cat in his hands there. But this was an excellent picture showing how a camp was made to take care of the cattle as long as they stayed there at that ranch. And I don't remember how long Daddy and Dan left the cattle over there, but I do know that both Daddy and Dan made the statement after it's over with that the next time the cattle left the ranch because of a drought, it would be somebody else owning them. This picture was made in 1953, and it shows Grandmother Midkiff standing out in the front yard of Mother's and Daddy's house in Kerrville in the front yard. This picture was made by me, Hazelle, in 1952 in Grandmother's house in Midland, and shows her standing by a portrait of Dan, Granddaddy Midkiff. This picture was made in 1956 by Hazelle and shows Daddy and Mother and Grandmother Midkiff in her living room there in Midland. This picture was made in 1913 showing Dan, Granddaddy Midkiff, with his 1912 Buick Roadster that he was so proud of. This picture was made in 1920 showing Dan and Grandmother Midkiff, T.O. Sr. and Lily Davenport Midkiff. This picture was made in 1924, and it shows Aunt Nell Midkiff, and she was one of Daddy's sisters, just older than he was, and this was made out at the ranch at that time. This picture was made in 1917, and it shows Frank and Jewel Midkiff with their little puppy dog standing in the front yard of the ranch. This picture was made when Hazelle was 2 years old in 1929, and it shows Hunter standing by Westbrook. Hunter was one of Daddy's younger brothers, and the building in the background was Mother's chicken house. This picture was made in 1927 by a mother showing Hazelle when she was 2 months old in her bassinet, which was a big wicker basket, and which I still have. Mother made this picture when it was on the front porch. This picture was made in 1928, showing Hazelle sitting on the back porch under all the milk buckets playing with a kitty cat. This picture was made in 1928, and it shows Mother standing holding me on the hood of Daddy's little coupe car. This picture was made in 1930, and it shows a mother holding Lois's hand, and Hazel's in the swing, and this was made at the back of the ranch house. Daddy had built me a swing to swing in out there. This shows the back of the house. This picture was made in 1935 and shows Dan and Grandmother Midkiff in front of their big old house at 1002 South Marionville in Midland. This picture was made in 1968, and it just shows the carriage house, barn, hay rack, milk stall, and everything, the big barn at the background, and a wooden fence had been built around. That was not the original fence, and it's very hard to see. In the center of the picture, way in the background, is Grandmother Midkiff standing near the curb watering some of her flowers. This picture was made in 1909 and is a picture of Uncle Bud Purcell on his horse. Uncle Bud had married Aunt Jeffy, which was one of Dan, my grandfather's sisters. This picture was made of Howard Moore and his red-bone hound dog, showing two foxes in a tree that Howard's always, when he'd ride out, he'd catch fox or skunks or coons or possums or something, was always bring them to the house. And he would train his dogs teaching them to retrieve these foxes. But he worked for Daddy off and on for several years. This picture was made in 1956, and it shows a bunch of us that were out hunting on Daddy's little place north of Kerrville that he just dearly loved. And standing by the Jeep was Les Groner, Tom Groner, and Walter Groner, and Joe Groner. And in the Jeep were Daddy and David Workman and T.O., and then I was taking the picture. But we had a lot of fun out. Everybody was hunting in those pastures up there. You can see there's a couple of deer laying on the hood. This picture was made at the same time in 1956 and shows the same bunch of hunters as in the previous picture. This picture was made in 1943 in the house at 1305 West Illinois Street and shows Mother and Daddy. That was Dick and Hattie Mae Midkiff. This picture was made in 1912 and is a picture of Aunt Betty Trammell Wilson. Aunt Betty was a full sister to Mother. This picture was made in 1964 by Hazelle at a family reunion at Frank's Ranch House, which was about 30 miles southeast of Midland, and shows the all except 2 of the living 12 kids. Uncle Herd was deceased, but Hunter and Dee were not in this picture. But standing left to right was Aunt Gladys and Lige and Jewel and Frank and Sam. And seated was Ann and Aunt Nell and Daddy Dick and Uncle Tyson. This picture was taken in 1925 and shows the 7 Midkiff brothers from left to right. That's Tyson, Herd, Dick, Frank, Hunter, Sam, and Lige. This picture was taken by Hazelle in 1964, and it shows their surviving 6 brothers of the Midkiff clan. That was Lige and Sam and Hunter and Frank and Dick and Tyson. This was taken at Frank's Ranch, southeast of Midland. This picture was taken in 1972 by Hazelle, and it shows 3 of Daddy's sister and Daddy. It was taken in front of Mother's and Daddy's house at 942 Pecan Street. And from left to right, it was Aunt Gladys McDonald and Aunt Dee Hanks and Aunt Nell Benedict and Daddy Dick Midkiff. This picture was made in 1972 and shows 3 of the Midkiff brothers, Sam on the left and Daddy, Dick, and Lige. This picture was made in 1977, and it shows Mother and Daddy and his oldest sister, Ann Brinson. She was living in an assisted living home there in Lubbock, Texas, and I had driven Mother and Daddy up to visit her. This picture, too, was made in 1977, and while we were in the area, I drove Mother and Daddy on up to Amarillo to see Mother's oldest sister, Aunt Olive. And in the picture from left to right is Daddy and Aunt Olive Dunn and Mother and Tom Dunn, Aunt Olive's oldest son, who was my cousin. This picture was made in 1968 in front of Aunt Olive's house. I had driven Mother and Daddy up there. Mother wanted to be with her kin, and this was 4 of her siblings, and left to right was Aunt Betty Wilson and Mother Hattie Mae Midkiff, and next to her in the pink was Aunt Beulah Daughtery, and then Aunt Olive Dunn, and in the back was John Trammell, one of the brothers. This picture was made at the same time with the same people, just another shot. This picture was made in 1911, and it shows Aunt Betty, Mother's younger sister. This picture was taken in 1985 of the ranch house out on Daddy's little ranch, which consisted of 371 acres, 18 miles north of Kerrville. And Daddy just dearly loved this little place. And this showed you some green grass and the trees all around. It was an old German Sunday house, and it was built in the early 1900s. This picture was taken in 1984 by Hazelle, and it showing a rundown condition of a house that was once in pretty good shape. And it's the old Fletcher place that Uncle Tyson and Aunt Nomi lived at, and when I was a little kid, used to go over and stay with them and play with them, but that was called the old Fletcher place. Their ranch was about 9 miles northwest of the home ranch. This picture was made in 1989, and it was of the house in Midland of 1305 West, Illinois, where we lived for several years and went to school. Daddy would carry us in either on late Sunday evening or early Monday morning, Mother and us kids, and we'd stay there till Friday evening, and Daddy would come get us and take us back to the ranch. And the house looks different now than it did then. It had a beautiful front yard. On May the 11th, 1945, a tornado hit the Walcott Ranch house, barns, and everything, chicken house, windmill, garage, which was about 35 miles north of Midland. And Dr. Campbell and Daddy had it leased as partners from the Walcott family. Dr. Campbell had married Walcott, and they leased it and were running cattle up there. And the tornado, in the background, there was a big barn and shed and pens and corrals back there, and a chicken house was to the right. And it completely wiped out all of that and broke out windows in the house, and you can see what it did to the trees. And I climbed up on the windmill tower. The wheel was gone. It took the wheel off, but I climbed up on the windmill tower and took these pictures. Following are some pictures that were made of that tornado in 1945, and this shows a piece of stovepipe that was wrapped around the chute out there where the cattle chute was. And it was interesting, it had laid that cattle, the ground was wet because it had rained, and it laid that side of the cattle chute down on the ground because there was imprint of everything in the mud, and then stood it back upright there and wrapped that piece of pipe around it. This is another shot of the devastation, the garage there, and shows Dr. Campbell and Daddy and Norfay Long, a friend of mine, and Horace Sutherland were all standing out there in the yard, and the house was left standing, but it had raised the roof about 4 inches off the top of the house and then just set it back down on where it was supposed to be. Awesome. Another picture, standing out there where Daddy and Dr. Campbell are, was where the chicken house was. And for days, naked chickens would come wandering back in to the house there, and you can see the windmill in the background, that the tower, but the wheel was gone. And down at the base of the windmill, and to the right was where the garage was. This is another picture of the tornado, and shows what little was left of a shed that was sitting next to the a barn, big barn there, and it was a granary, and that white area in the background was where they'd scattered all the grain, the corn and the maize out there. This is an interesting shot. It shows a picture of the corner of either a chicken house, a shed, barn, or something that was jammed into the ground. Just those pieces of board were stuck about a foot or more into the ground, just jammed into the ground. Still another shot of the tornado, and kind of in the center there was a corn crib, and there's a pile of corn shucks, a corn that was still in the shucks right there. It had demolished the shed and everything around it. And way back in the background, Daddy had a trailer that he hauled implements and stuff on, and it was on a Dodge chassis. And the wheels, the trailer was bottom up, and the wheels are sticking up in the air back there, the Dodge wheels of it. This is a closer picture of what was left of the trailer there. You can see I twisted it and banged it up and carried way out away from the barns and the pens. That was where the barn was, way in the background, and this was what was left of the trailer. This picture was made in 1948 and shows a picture of the draw that was right south of the house, and the fence line, that what was left of it across the draw. We'd had a real hard, heavy 3-inch rain, and it had put this little draw up really big and wide, and it washed out all the fence and everything, but it shows a good bit of water going down the draw toward the lake. This is just another view of the same draw, same direction, and this was in October of 48 like the other one was. Both pictures made at the same time, and a little different view. This is another view of the same rain at the same time in 1948, and was a big old walnut tree that was sitting in the south pasture in the draw, just down from the windmill a piece. And the Y in the tree was about 4 feet up from the ground, so you can see that the water was about 4 feet deep right there, and that wasn't in the middle of the deepest part of the draw, but it just shows how wide that little draw was. This picture was also made in October of 1948, and this was down at the Tippett Ranch where the Calcoats lived, and shows a picture of the corrals and the pens and load and chute and everything there that was near a lake, and that lake had this big heavy rain that just fell so hard and fast, filled this lake up and got all up in the pens and the corrals there. This view was back at a Midkiff Ranch house, and shows a view taken from the south pasture looking down toward the buck trap. That little draw went from the house trap south of the house down through the south pasture and on through the buck trap on the way through to the lake in the far distance. It can't be seen, but the little draw was not real deep, but it's real shallow, and it was moving on. This was back at the Tippett Ranch again, and the water in the lake came up nearly to I was standing just inside the yard fence in the backyard of the old Tippett place there, looking down toward the lake, and you can see how close the lake came to filling up close to the house. Another view of the lake and the pens that's almost underwater at the Tippett place. Just another view of all the water and the damage and the debris and stuff the little draw had washed out down at the Tippett place where Mr. and Miss Calcoat had, they were working for Mr. Vic Tippett there, and they lived down there on what we call the Tippett Ranch. And this just shows a view looking out down toward their lake by the house. This is a picture taken of T.O. and one of his friends, Bobby Ingram, and they were fixing to dive off the diving board into what we call the big concrete tank down east of the house, and they were fixing to go swimming in there, and they were cutting up. And this was made probably in the mid 40s, maybe 44, 45. I don't have an exact date. This picture was made in the spring of 1942, and it was during the war, and we kids were working in what we were called a frame garden. Daddy had built a frame at the end of what we called the adobe room back there, which was we three kids' room, girls' room, and built a frame, and we planted lettuce and beets and carrots and vegetables in this frame garden. And this frame garden had a plastic like wire, hail screen wire covered with plastic that covered it up and kept it from freezing or too much sun or whatever, and it was sub-irrigated. It was a project that we three girls had undertaken, and Miss Lynn, the county home demonstration agent, took the picture, and that's T.O. in the foreground, and then that was Maydell there, and then Lois, and Hazelle's looking over the fence at the back of it. This picture was made probably in the 1940, 41 or 2 of Daddy sitting in the living room at our house in town at 1305 West Illinois. This picture was made in 1982 at an old-timers reunion that Rankin had, and I drove Daddy up there, and we attended that. And this picture shows Quad Midkiff, who was T.O.'s youngest son, and T.O. the third, which was my younger brother, and shows Daddy there. Instead, they were standing out there close to a farm that at their feet was a big board that had all the brands branded on it in the area. This picture was made in 1978 in the front yard of Mother's and Daddy's house at 942 Pecan Street in Kerrville, and on the front row, left to right, was Lois, and then my daddy, and Hazelle, and Mother, and in the back row was T.O., and Maydell, and Richard. That was we 5 kids, and Mother and Daddy. This picture was made in 1983 of T.O., and I had driven Daddy up to T.O.'s, and then T.O. and Daddy and I went to Canyon, Texas, and went into the Palo Duro Canyon to see the Texas play, and then took a ride on what they call the Mad Monkey Railroad, and that shows T.O. there standing by the little railroad that we had ridden on it around the canyon.